Hey, what's up, guys? Well, another tough day at the office yesterday. I lost to Grandmaster Sipke Ernst from the Netherlands. And yeah, honestly, what happened is I basically entered into a very sharp line right from the opening. A line I haven't checked in a while, maybe some years, and that was just not a good practical choice, and I ended up being punished for it. So we'll see what happened. The game started d4, knight f6, c4, e6. Kind of intending the Nimzo-Indian if white plays knight c3, but I played knight f3, and he goes for c5. So this is a pretty typical move order for black to try and get a Benoni since white has already committed the knight to f3 and can't play some of the more dangerous lines using the f-pawn. I think it's quite reasonable for black, but it's not my first time playing the position, of course, so I was fine going into this. But yeah, d6, knight c3, the line we got in the Benoni ended up being one that I really should have put in more work on beforehand because it was quite sharp. G6, e4, bishop g7, bishop e2, castles, castles. Now black has a lot of options here. I mean, bishop g4 is very popular just to trade the bishop for the knight and get good control over the e5 square. And I would have been perfectly fine playing this. But he goes for rook e8, which mainly asks white to play knight d2, knight d7, and yeah, this is a very theoretical position and very sharp one. And yeah, I don't think I should have allowed this, having not really checked the line before the game, because I wasn't really expecting Benoni in this game. Well, okay, I played rook e1, this is the main move, knight e5. And now h3. Okay, so this move is pretty common and it's a useful move to control the g4 square. In some cases, white might want to even play f4. I mean, there's a common trap here if black plays like bishop d7, then this takes away all of the escape squares from the knight on e5, and white already plays f4 and wins a piece, assuming black doesn't have some tactical way out of it. So h3 is pretty useful, and he spent a little bit of time here and played g5, which wasn't actually a surprise, because I was still familiar with the position up until this point, but not as familiar as I would have liked to be. I basically knew that this is playable for both sides, and it's a very sharp game, and usually white tries to put the knight on f1 and then maybe g3 to take advantage of the newly weakened f5 square. So yeah, this is a well-known line. The point for black, of course, is to take control over the f4 square and secure the knight on e5. And yeah, it leads to some sharp positions. As you can imagine, black is immediately just playing very, very aggressively on the king side. So after some thought, I played knight f1 here, hitting the pawn on g5, and he goes h6, which is still following the main line. g4 is certainly playable, but white here usually takes on g4, and after, let's say, knight f takes g4, the best move is f3. Just kicking the knight. If the knight goes back, then I think white is okay. If black goes for something like queen h4, I believe this doesn't work. I mean, it looks very scary, like if you take, he takes with the knight, and then bishop d4 check becomes a huge threat in the position. But I think white has this move g3. This is what I learned after the game. During the game, I didn't know these details, so as you can imagine, it's kind of a big problem when you're looking at this sharp position for the first time. And of course, your opponent's like an experienced grandmaster who has played the Benoni before. I mean, I was aware of his repertoire. So clearly, he might be like very familiar with this stuff. And over the board, it's just very, very difficult to figure out. So yeah, had he played g4, I would have had a real think here, because I wasn't sure whether I should take or push h4. I think h4 is quite dubious for the record. White should take on g4 and then go for these lines with f3. But if you don't have like computer preparation here, it's a tough position to play over the board. Just white's king has a lot of weaknesses, and it's just a very concrete position. White really needs to know what we're doing. Okay, in any case, he played h6, which I did remember was kind of the main line. And this is basically where my knowledge ended. Like, I had a pretty good idea the move was knight g3, but I wasn't sure, and I was looking at other options as well. Eventually, I decided just to play this move anyway, because to me it looked like the most flexible move in the position. But objectively, this is probably already slightly inaccurate. In my opinion, white should either play knight e3 and then a4, and the knight on e3 is actually, I think, better placed than on g3 because it's controlling the g4 square, so black can't make this advance, which is quite dangerous and happens in the game. Or the move just starting with a4, which is a typical idea in these positions. Black often is the first to play a6, but sometimes white plays a4 themselves, just because we know we were going to want to make this move in the future, and we have this idea to like put the rook on a3 in many positions, which not only can cover the third rank, but can also in some positions swing to b3 and put some pressure this way. Not to mention white also wants to kind of advance with a5. So looking at it after the game, I learned that this is probably the way white should play the position. Okay, so going back to the game, after some thought, I played knight g3. He played a6, I pushed a4. The engine, for some reason, actually preferred black to play g4 right away. Now the point is because after h takes g4, he can take, and f3 runs into queen h4. So this is kind of the concrete reason why the knight on g3 is dubious. Strategically, it looks excellently placed. It's covering h5 and f5, but in the variations, it ends up hanging, and so this is a problem for white. And so, needless to say, if white takes on g4, black just takes here, and white just has too many weaknesses on the dark squares, and already like the bishop is showing up on g4, the knight d4, the knight is coming to g4. It's just super dangerous for white. So he ended up playing a6, a4, and then g4, and for some reason the engine doesn't like the inclusion of these moves for black. Normally it's in black's favor to insert these two moves in the Benoni because he gets to cover the b5 square, and so white never has any like knight b5 or bishop b5 tempos in the position. Not that I would have them, but at least now they're covered. But I guess the point is that this actually just helps white kind of advance my main counterplay in the position, because now I have this idea to play a5, knight a4, and knight to b6. So this ends up being an incredibly important plan. I think, as I discovered during the game, it's probably white's main source of counterplay in the position. The point is, once the knight gets to b6, I want to trade the light square bishop off. Normally you wouldn't want to do this in the Benoni. Normally it's black who's spending tempo to play bishop g4 and take on f3. But the reason white is supposed to do it here is because once the bishop comes off, I'm going to be able to use the f5 square, which is hugely important. Actually, I first learned about this idea because I was playing black against Grandmaster Christian Karilla, and he kind of played a similar idea against me, not in a Benoni, but in a Benoni-like position, where he put his knight on a4, my bishop was on d7, I took on a4, he recaptured, and then his other knight was able to use the f5 square quite nicely. So it's definitely a nice idea, and here I think white is, well, that's what white is trying to do. Okay, so after h4, again, I was spending some time. After g4, I was spending some time. I really didn't want to take because that looked too dangerous, so eventually I decided on h4. I was also thinking about f4 here, which might be a safer choice objectively, and I think white is still okay here. After takes. Black definitely doesn't want to take on f3 and give up his strong knight, because then white's pieces just immediately start to flow in the position, and like knight is coming to f5 and just looks very nice for white. Instead, I figured black would probably play this move knight h7, opening up the queen to h4 and also trying to bring the knight to g5. And this is a pretty active plan. I think black gets counterplay here, but objectively white is probably doing fine. Okay, so I push h4. Eventually I just felt like, I don't know, to me this kind of seemed like the right thing to do. He goes knight h7, which was definitely expected, targeting the pawn. And here I was mainly deciding between h5 and knight h5. Knight h5, eventually I just felt like I wasn't quite getting enough for the pawn. I take his dark squared bishop, but so what? All of his other pieces are still really good, and yeah, black has an extra pawn now, so I didn't see why white should be doing so well here. I ended up going with h5, which, okay, just defends the pawn. Queen h4, a5, I realized I really have to get my play going again with knight a4, knight b6, and knight g5. So he's just fully going for the kingside attack. So yeah, now I just I had no idea. During the game, I already felt very pessimistic about my position because black's threats look extremely dangerous. Immediately, if I pass or play something like knight a4, I thought the threat was to give this knight with check so that the bishop can come to d4. And if I take, there's like knight h3 check, and this just looked incredibly dangerous. Knight takes f2. King takes f2, there's going to be like queen h2 check, and then bishop d4, and then taking on f3, and then the bishop shows up on h3 with mate, for example. So I didn't get like a fully concrete picture of how exactly black wins, win by move, but probably something like this. Actually, just taking on f3 already looks devastating, followed by bishop h3 mate. So yeah, this looked incredibly dangerous to me. I think the engine points out that other than knight h3 check, black can also just play this move bishop d4, which is pretty sick, threatening to take the knight on g3, and white just has no defense here. Bishop e3, black can just take and collect and win everything. So, okay, I really have to do something here. The engine is saying I could play a move like bishop e3, just covering the d4 square ahead of time, and I was really considering this. But yeah, I just felt like it still looks too dangerous. Black has f5. The engine actually likes to move rook f8, followed by f5, and it says it's playable, but black still has a lot of initiative here. So going back, what I should have done, as I discovered after the game, was not to even bother with the h-pawn and just immediately advance with a5 here. And there's actually a game here played between two GMs, Burkus as white versus Richard Rappert as black. So this was back in 2012. So at the time, Burkus was a higher rated player versus Rappert. Rappert was around 25-50. And yeah, this is definitely the key way for white to play. Sacrifice the pawn, you play knight a4, and I'm basically getting this knight b6 takes on c8 idea, followed by putting my other knight on f5 most likely. So yeah, that game was quite interesting, and white won quite convincingly. So yeah, I kind of stumbled onto this like a5 idea during the game, but I definitely didn't have enough confidence in it to just give up the h4 pawn. But it turns out the pawn was far less important than just the tempo, the move that I could use to play this knight a4, knight b6. Because the game, it turns out to be very concrete. After a5, knight g5, eventually in this position I decided to hack on g5. I was definitely sad about giving up my dark squared bishop, but I also thought it's not the end of the world, because I will be getting some counterplay. So queen takes g5, and then I went for knight a4. So objectively, this is another mistake, and here the mistakes, they start piling on for me, because I committed to a plan, but it was the wrong plan, concretely a losing plan. Not to say that the plan is bad, brother, it's just too slow. Move by move, black's attack ends up faster. Here I really should have played the move queen to c1. And I realized this move is playable. I wasn't sure about this endgame, but actually white is doing totally fine, and an endgame is a lot better than getting checkmated. And I have, again, natural play with knight a4, knight b6. This idea is still here. And then, of course, rook b1 and b4 is always a typical idea in these positions. So instead, yeah, I end up going for knight a4. He plays f5, which I was definitely expecting, as it looks like the sharpest move for counterplay. And then, yeah, knight b6 is another error, but as you can see, once you kind of commit to the idea, if it ends up being not working, then that's on you, and that can decide the game just like that. This was the last chance to try and bail out with e takes f5, bishop takes f5, queen c1, and here black is undoubtedly better, because he has ideas of putting something on d3, and the bishop on g7 is just really strong, but still playable position for white, and I certainly would have better chances of holding this than in the game. So yeah, knight b6, and then comes f4, which I was also expecting, but I thought I would have a way out here. A very strong move. So if I take the rook on a8, of course black is taking on g3, and if f takes g3, black just has a ton of compensation, because the bishop is coming to d4, and that's going to be a very nasty check. The queen can take on h5. But I think the most decisive was this move, knight to c4. Maybe black doesn't even have to sacrifice something, but this move was very difficult to meet because bishop d4 check, king f1, rook f8, and black is going to put mate on the dark squares. So yeah, once we got to this position, it's like, okay, I knew I didn't have to take the rook. I would have other options here, but already it's just looking extremely dicey for white and most likely losing. I ended up playing queen d2, so this was the move I kind of had in mind before that I thought was possible. But when you're calculating this from afar, you're always going to miss stuff, and so that's definitely what happened here. So the idea is legit. If he takes on g3, I can trade queens. And then whether or not he takes on f2, eventually I'm going to take the rook on a8. So he has to, let's say, take back on g5. I take the rook, takes, and, well, I'm up in exchange, and my knight is getting out to b6. So, for sure black has compensation, but I would be really surprised if, like, black is winning this. But, of course, he's not forced to take on g3. My other idea was that, well, if he plays rook b8, then I have time to finally take the bishop, rook takes, and put my knight on f5. And yeah, it still looks extremely dangerous for white, but I didn't see 100% how black is winning here. Because he can't really play f3 because I'll trade queens, and if g3 I'll take. And then he can't recapture without allowing a queen trade as well. So I didn't think this was that obvious. And queen takes h5, I take on f4. And I think white is now in control. But he comes up with a much stronger move here, rook f8. And he's reinstituting the threat of f takes g3 because then he wants to take on f2 with check. I won't be able to recapture, and then he can take the rook on e1 and promote to a new queen. So yeah, this move was very strong, and like once we got here, I kind of realized I'm losing. I tried rook f1. Now if he takes, at least I have f2 covered, so I can again take on g5. But he plays a much better move, queen h4. I mean, he's not even interested in taking the knight necessarily, he's just playing for checkmate, which, yeah, I think from black's point of view, this was a really nice attacking game. It turns out the engine already shows knight f3 check as winning, which was a surprising shot. The point is, after g takes f3, now apparently queen h4 is a lot stronger. And he wants to take on g3 and, of course, give bishop d4 check at some point. And, yeah, like this bishop on d4, bishop on c8, queen on h4, rook on f8, like if they're working together, and the pawns as well, it's just very, very difficult for white to defend here. And, yeah, apparently white has just lost like -8 or something. Okay, queen h4 is also winning. I tried rook a3. So, okay, if he takes on g3, I can recapture. And then I get this tempo on the queen, and then I can have time to take the rook on a8. But finally, after this move, he goes rook b8. He just saves his rook from the corner. It was hanging for like 3-4 moves, but of course I could never take it. Now I took on c8, rook b takes c8. And we reach this position where, yeah, white is just basically busted because the two pawns, f4, g4, are just so strong here. And concretely, black is just breaking through. Knight h1 is almost too ugly to consider. I mean, I certainly did consider it, but after f3, white is just completely lost and getting mated. So I played knight f5. This was kind of my only chance. Rook takes f5, ef5, g3. I'm forced to take on g3, and because of the mate on h2, I definitely have to take with the rook. Queen takes g3. And white has essentially ended up down a piece for one pawn. I played on for a few moves here because after f6, bishop f8, I realized it's like not actually the easiest position for black to convert, mainly because the bishop on f8 has no squares. It's like fully restricted. The knight on e5 looks super good, but it's also being kind of restricted by the bishop on e2, covering all the jumps. And it's not easy for black to get like the rook into the game. So, okay, objectively, it's like, white is completely lost and black can do a number of things here to convert, but I figured I'd play on just to, just to see, like, just to make him show, like, the winning plan. So queen c2, rook c7, queen e4, I think he converted quite smoothly here. c4, he just starts making like incremental progress. Now white has to make moves. The only thing tricky here for black, it's like he has to be careful not to blunder something because he doesn't want to allow some kind of like f7 check idea. But he was careful enough and managed to win the game without a whole lot of drama. Queen d3, queen f4, he takes on d5. I play queen f5. Rook f7, just putting this pawn under control. King h1, queen d4. I play g4 just to stop queen h4 check and try to play like g5 and maybe open the the g file. And then he played bishop g7. And here, yeah, I decided it was time to resign because he wants to take the pawn on f6. Of course, I was definitely hoping for like bishop e7, which would allow me to take and then promote to a new queen. But yeah, that's unlikely. Bishop g7. And there's nothing I can do. g5, he'll give check on h4 and just totally clean up. So, yeah, after bishop g7, I resigned. It was a very tough game, but, you know, like, I think, again, the mistake was more of a practical nature in terms of, like, entering this line. Actually, after the game, my opponent told me that he basically knew it up until this point as well. He didn't really know much more than this. But yeah, here, this is where I kind of started playing somewhat inaccurately, and my biggest mistake was in this point. Playing h5 and keeping the pawn was really just, I think, maybe too optimistic or too naive or something. I really needed to just go for it with a5. And then had I played this move and found seeing the right idea, then yeah, it's a kind of a different story. But clearly this is work that should have been done at home. So it's kind of inexcusable to show up to a game, you know, play like this super sharp line against a strong player, you know, GM, and expect, you know, just to be able to wing it. So yeah, that one's on me, but what can you do? I'm now on 4 out of 8, so I'm back to even. Still having a relatively decent performance, but yeah, these last 2 losses have really pushed me down a bit. I'll try to come back in the final 2 games, and I'll see you then. So take care.